Dr. Pasek is the Canada Research Chair in Media, Culture, and the Environment, and an assistant professor cross-appointed between the Department of Cultural Studies and the School of the Environment at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. She studies the cultural politics of climate change, focusing in particular on how carbon becomes mediated and meaningful in different institutional and social contexts. As an energy humanist, she further investigates the connection between the research methods, academic norms, and carbon intensity, developing and prototyping low-carbon alternatives for conducting research and sustaining collegial connections. This afternoon, she'll be discussing the environmental and informational costs of machine learning and deep learning technologies. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you all to the folks who helped bring me here. I'm having a lovely time already. First of all, mic is good. No reason to. I'm going to assume the mic is good. Move onwards. Let me know if it's not. So here's a map of where I'm going to go in my talk today. We've got sort of two rough parts. Firstly, I'm going to lay out a case for why we should probably think about so-called AI as a bit of a pollution problem, both in terms of the environmental impacts of the technologies and infrastructures themselves, but also in terms of what it does to our informational systems and social relations. I'm also going to explore some ways that we know what we know about the problem, as well as what we don't know, what we can't know, at least for now. I'm going to use some of the analytic tools in discard studies, which is a field of study, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second, to think about a range of different forms of action that might come from these insights. I'll state from the advance, probably the cash value here is not stuff that will feed into a beautiful legal case that will solve the world, but a larger portfolio of tactics, which might include Copilot, might not. I'm curious to know what you might think. So basically, I'm going to ping pong across a couple of different forms of harm and analogies, thinking through that kind of metaphorical way of one thing being like another, across fields of studies that you might assume have nothing to do with so-called AI, but hopefully we'll get to a really interesting point of synthesis at the end. But first of all, who am I to talk trash about AI? I am, by training, a media and environmental studies scholar. So my areas of expertise include the environmental impact of the digital sector, public discourses and politics popping up around these topics, as well as low carbon degrowthy experiments in building alternative networks and degrowth computing. I also do have a history of collaboration with some parts of this industry. So I'm a consultant in sustainable subsea networks, which is a group of folks that are working on building best practices and carbon footprinting tools for folks that make the World Wide Web worldwide, all those lovely fiber optic cables under the ocean. This is to say that I think networks are really important. I think there's real value to building information systems that help us share stuff across distance. Often digitizing things we would need to exclusively do in person. There's a climate benefit to that. So I like computers. I want them to stay around. But also, I am not an AI researcher, right? I cannot train you a large language model. It's easier for me to read a financial sheet or a politician's speech than to review your code. But I sort of stumbled backwards into studying this topic, studying the people who study machine learning, because as Nicholas laid out, I'm really, really interested in what it might mean to decarbonize our universities. And if we look at the sort of climate impacts of research, one really large area is folks who are working on machine learning and deep learning. So I've written a paper currently under review about what this community of researchers is making of that problem, how they're trying to decarbonize their own field of study. And there's some really, really interesting kind of equity arguments that get built into these fumblings towards what green AI might look like in the academy. Because it turns out the carbon intensity of compute articulates also to the question of who gets to be a researcher in the field in really interesting ways. But also just like a lot of us in media studies today, I'm kind of unfortunately obliged to have an AI hot take. I think we all kind of relate to this with some degree of grumpiness. So I've got a commentary out in the Journal of the Environmental Media, where there is one such polemic, and the seeds of that are going to be stuff that I'm developing in the talk here today. And then I've also got a chapter with a colleague on the role of like AI commercial development and the challenges of decarbonizing the energy grid. So if you want to get really wonky and talk about energy policy, I'm very down for that. But that won't be the focus of this talk. But importantly, I am super not a lawyer. I'm also not an American, so I don't fully understand the peculiarities of your legal regimes. My expertise really extends only to wishing ill on tech billionaires and their antitrust lawsuits. And I'm also just like a huge geek about Massachusetts versus EPA for climate reasons. Which means that I'm thrilled to be talking with you here today, because I hope it's going to be one of those interdisciplinary exchanges where like maybe you have as much to teach me as I hopefully have to teach you. I'm going to be gesturing to some areas where I think the law is implicated in my arguments, and I hope that you can help me think through them a little bit further. So let's get started. Just by flagging maybe a question that you have in your head, right? Like, why is trash an appropriate frame to think about this problem? I got 3 answers to that question. One is that I think that derision and public mockery are salutary for our politics in moments where there's like out of control tech hype. And so I know Emily Bender was here earlier. You probably heard a similar story from her. She's one of the greats in this space. You know, if we are in a moment where like the tech emperor kind of has no clothes, like we should have acerbic fashion advice to offer. Secondly, in the environmental space, there's often like a disconnect between discussions about parts per million CO2 and like the gigawatt and hours of renewable energy certificates, all of which, you know, help us govern a problem on like a national or a global register, but often don't connect to things that are locally meaningful or like felt in people's everyday experience. We often end up becoming sort of like scolds, right, in ways that can be unhelpful for us building coalitions that we need to win the things we want. So by sticking with trash and trying to attend to the ways that this pops up for people in their sort of like sensory experience of the world, I want to, you know, keep that sort of global and local register in tandem, because I do think that that's sort of politically important for folks in the environmental movement to do today. But finally, the real origin story is that there's this stupid AI trash can that's been haunting me. So it's a product of a Canadian AI startup that promises to democratize waste wisdom. And you might be saying, like, what the hell does that mean? Well, there's one version of Oscar, the trash can, where you sort of wave your hand over a conveyor belt and you drop your garbage into it. And then a machine learning tool with image recognition scans your garbage and decides whether the conveyor belt will move to the left or the right and sort your trash accordingly. In other versions of the tool, you just kind of like present your garbage to the camera and the screen will tell you, you know, like you've got recycling, put it in this bin, very good. But like many things in this contemporary sort of pivot to AI moment, I think this is an obviously stupid product. Right? Like, the first thing is there's a carbon cost to doing all this model training, to manufacturing all these cameras, installing them, running inferencing, all that stuff. And I don't have any data whatsoever on Oscar in particular, but I think we've all seen enough headlines to know that like this environmental solution is going to come with an environmental cost. And yeah, the carbon smart thing to do would just be to think, like, is my object made of glass? Is my object not? But we're sort of trading that for, again, like running inference on, you know, maybe hundreds of thousands of images a day if this thing takes off. The second and bigger thing, though, is that this is a product that is set up to solve the wrong problem. People do not have a hard time telling whether or not the stuff that they have at hand is recyclable. They have a hard time, like, finding the time to care about it. Like all the time. Plus, maybe they're rightfully a little bit cynical about the value of recycling, right? At least here in North America, the minor scandal is that quite a lot of your plastics recycling does not get recycled, it gets landfilled. And if it does get recycled, it gets shipped to somewhere in Southeast Asia, where again, it might still get landfilled. And even if it does get broken down and recombined, downcycled into some other form of plastic, like that's a really environmentally intensive process with negative externalities. The carbon benefit of that is by no means clear. So, you know, what this company is doing is sort of adding an additional bit of friction to a process that's probably already broken. And if that added process of all that training data, all that inferencing, all those conveyor belts, like if that consumes resources that do not meaningfully like change the outputs of these systems, then the system is trash, right? It's itself a kind of waste. So I'm stuck on this trash can thing, right? Like the AI trash can is trash. And I think that this is maybe true of many of our broad experiences of so-called AI. They're all sometimes quite trashy. So to give an example, if we replace traditional Google search with their AI summary tool, the energy costs of running that are about 10 times more intensive. So it's an order of magnitude worse to get the AI summary. And you can't opt out of them anymore, right? Like they're being rolled out on a larger number of topics to a larger number of markets, on what is a default monopoly for internet search, right? Like this is quite a consequential decision in aggregate. People are sort of wondering if ChatGPT is going to come along and break up the Google monopoly on search to some degree. If they do succeed, they will do so with a product that is a further order of magnitude worse. And it's not clear to me that either of these products are 10 times better, right? Like we're sort of adding waste to a system without changing its outcomes, and making it sort of the default mandatory way that you interact with these systems too. And one thing that I want to stress is that waste isn't just a question of carbon emissions, right? There's also a sort of social and cultural dimension to sort of the pollution of our informational environment. And the first symptom of information pollution we might say is spam, and I'm sure we've seen a lot of it lately. In the commercial internet, where attention is monetized, there are going to be bad actors seeking to grab your attention for things that you don't care about. So the internet is, being flooded with sort of SEO optimized trash. There's also a huge amount of AI slop, which is designed purposely to be nonsensical, because that itself is attention seeking, attention grabbing. So there's a problem with the quantity of the stuff, but also just like the quality has these kind of, brain grating characteristics. And this is a problem because, these sort of like false positives in the sea of information seem to be driving more people to use so-called AI search tools when they're doing their information search processes. Like the hope is, maybe ChatGPT will be more trustworthy or like more attention sparing than Google search seems to be becoming. But in many cases, and I'm sure we've all seen some of these, right? So-called AI can be worse, in part because these generative systems are confident liars, right? These lies can be innocuous, like not being able to count the number of R's in the word strawberry. Or they can be more subtle and far more consequential, such as Google Gemini lying about the number of signatories to the Declaration of Independence that were slaveholders. And of course, there's also just like a huge number of scams on top of this. The problem of reinforcing bias and stereotypes, all things that are sort of degrading social trust. And on balance, like this is looking like a real problem for society. One smaller subsection of this question, but still quite worrying, is the role of information pollution in our informational commons, right? Like whether that's peer-reviewed publications or publicly managed data archives. So this is to say, like being an editor of a journal is getting even worse as like AI slop just kind of like washes over your processes. And sometimes that slop is pretty obvious. Like here we have, to my mind, an extremely hilarious generated image of what is supposed to be a scientific diagram of like testicular stem cells in rats. There's a lot going on here that is not that. Though this image did make it through peer review, I should stress, right? In other cases, it's much more ambiguous and subtle, such as in Wikipedia. We've seen this sort of community that has like internally created norms for volunteer editor labor that are being sort of destabilized by people feeling emboldened by generative language models to just be an expert on something and copy and paste what the model said into Wikipedia. So they're trying to develop tools that can do AI detection and sort of due diligence. But it's really not clear whether or not they're able to kind of catch up with this wave of generative models at the gates. So that's a problem. And I do wonder if there's something similar happening in law. We are seeing a rise of court filings that contain fictional information. And there have been a couple of splashy fines, some sharp words from judges recently, but that's only for the stuff that's been caught. And I do worry about the stuff that I think is probably slipping by. And I'm, again, an outsider to this legal profession, but I do have the impression that law is sort of like a giant citational chain, right? Where the integrity of one link is really predicated on like having clear, traceable connections to the one that came before it and the one that came before it. And so I do sort of worry about the long-term consequences of informational pollution in that system, right? There's no bad actors here or people with like malicious intent, but there is maybe quite significant consequences to this all. So we'll see how your profession handles that challenge. And just to get a sense of where things might be headed, I looked up, this is an excerpt of an email from a guy in Morgan & Morgan, which is an injury law firm here in your country. And this email makes it clear to lawyers in the firm that like synthetic text will contain falsehoods. And so you have to rigorously verify everything that the large language model tells you. And the analogy here, I guess, is, like failing to catch fictional law is going to be akin to failing to catch a case reversal. Like, I don't know if that's a good analogy or not. I'd be really interested to hear your opinion. So much of this is done through the work of analogy, right? Like, does thinking through this past pattern help us like react to a present undetermined problem? I always find those questions fascinating. Another thing that really interests me is that AI trash is a problem for AI researchers themselves. So our dominant paradigm for building these large language models and generative image models as well really depends on grabbing just an increasing volume of training data to like make the thing bigger and better. This is why AI companies more or less indiscriminately collect all the data they can, regardless of consent or context or copyright, right? This is why OpenAI is breaking the law so dang much. It's because linear advances in sort of like model quality in the benchmarks that are valued by the industry tends to depend on just like giving exponentially more compute time and data to the training process. Linear gains for exponential inputs. It's a harsh sort of treadmill to run on. And the problem is that new sources of data are scarcer and scarcer and increasingly contaminated with AI trash. So AI trash, we might say, is not good for young AI minds. If you keep training models on generative outputs, you get what's called model collapse. And you might sort of like think, again, through analogy, like this is kind of the machine learning version of audio feedback, like getting your speakers to screech at you. It isn't pretty. And there's been some speculation that this is why OpenAI's ChatGPT-5 launch has been so underwhelming. Like maybe this company has kind of poisoned the digital well that it drinks from with their product, such that the sort of mass scraping of the internet is less useful than it used to be. So some people are beginning to think about a kind of boundary condition in the history of our digital data. As if we were like paleontologists sort of looking across the strata in a rock for, like a golden spike event. And it does seem like we have one of those events with the mass introduction of generative text and images online. There's a before and an after to ChatGPT going public, and we're sort of living now in a post-Lapsarian world. So this all culminates, to me, in a bit of a metaphor. We're witnessing the equivalent of something like a new pollutant in our cultural and informational systems, which also happens to come with a lot of environmental pollution to local air and global climate all at the same time. And so maybe we've got the kind of rise of like informational single-use plastic. I'm not the only person to make that connection, but I think it's a powerful one, right? Like we have the rise of single-use text and sort of disposable images in a new way. And just like in the 1950s, when petrochemical CEOs were thinking about the prospects of flooding the markets with plastic, they didn't think about the long-term public health crises their products were going to cause over the course of many lifetimes much longer than their own. I think we have a parallel problem here with novel informational and environmental pollution. So let's explore that problem. And normally when I'm speaking to a new audience about climate and tech stuff, I've got to do a lot of scaffolding. I've got to, be like, hey, the cloud is someone else's computer and the digital is not truly immaterial. Computational work requires minerals and energy, and like this whole thing is becoming increasingly consequential to the climate trajectories of the world. But I do think the cat's out of the bag when it comes to so-called AI, right? There's been a wave of news stories, I'm sure you've seen a lot of them, that sort of focus on the energy and climate emissions of all this stuff. And so far the story generally is just a story about quantity, right? There are numbers that are large. The line is going up. These figures are shocking. AI will boil the oceans. And so, like, on the one hand, I'm really happy people are talking about my topic. Like, that's great. On the other hand, I'm worried about how they are talking about my topic, right? I think there are some worrying conceptual limitations to this kind of framing, some sort of political dead ends that this inquiry brings to public discourse. Like I'm not unsympathetic to folks who are like, this is sort of like reactionary techlash stuff. Like, I think that's part of the picture here. Alternatively, the kind of scripts for action that we get here are all about just like big numbers rather than big systems. And they don't maybe accurately diagnose how those systems work, both technically and politically. So AI, is kind of confronting us here as something that's coherent, that's external, and maybe unstoppable. And that's bad for climate politics. And when we do talk about what actions people could take about the AI climate problem, it's usually only in relation to personal consumer habits. So there's like vernacular tips like this one that you can find about how to minimize the carbon impacts of your ChatGPT use. These tips are not actually that impactful. I don't think anyone, could pledge a happy life towards them, moreover. I basically think they're kind of about like palliating your sense of guilt, rather than like getting into a fight that will help you win new social relations towards these technologies and companies, which is where I would put my goals at. And when we talk about the information pollution part of it, like, I think there's a parallel there too, right? We sort of acknowledge that this stuff can be frustrating, but also maybe kind of humorous, maybe absurd. Maybe it's something that we should learn to tolerate better, or we could feel better about our own inputs being, more sophisticated than bad AI fails. Alternatively, we might respond with education, right? There's sort of like a concern that like the role of the university should be in part to teach people to be more skeptical and to be better detectors of AI scams. Sometimes this proceeds under the framework of AI literacy or pedagogy, and there's like a lot of initiatives under such monikers that are funded by tech companies, which maybe tells you something. Another tech company favorite would be to talk about the goal of building more ethical AI, So if we kind of like retroactively patch a model, adjust the weights here or there, we could solve the bias problem. Maybe, it hasn't happened yet. This work tends to be quite reactive, and again, like centered on like individual consumer experiences of the technology, without really giving a full account of like who are all the players in the system, and it presumes that that system is here to stay, and it's something we just need to like adapt to or manage. And as someone from the climate movement, like whenever I see that framing of a problem, I think we are giving far too much away from the start. So let's get a more systematic view of what's going on, starting with what we can't know. How these models get trained and weighted, how much compute they use, what kinds of energy and water attends to where that compute is happening, the carbon implications of that grid, of those watersheds. These things all really, really matter when it comes to precisely assessing the environmental impacts of so-called AI. The tricky thing is we do not have that data. Estimates do exist, but these figures are partial and contingent. They really only give us a glimpse of what might be the general shape of AI's energy usage. And the folks who have this data internally, companies like Meta, Microsoft, and OpenAI, they simply are not sharing the environmental information. And they have broader reporting practices, but they take great pains to not include figures that are specific to their so-called AI tools. And under Biden, there was a plan to create a voluntary framework to get companies to do versions of AI-specific disclosures, but Trump repealed that, I think, in the first 24 hours of his second presidency, so probably at the behest of some big donors. which means that we're probably just not going to get this information for the next 3 years at least. And this is a problem for like all the environmental lawyers out there, as I understand it, right? Since, you know, if you want to stick a claim in court, you need to have accurate, precise information to sort of back up your claims. But here we are in a context where we have to figure out how to act without that precision. Right? The politics of knowledge here are tricky. And by the way, in rare cases where companies do disclose some data, that data is extremely selective. So Google, for example, recently shared that a single Gemini query, or rather the median user case for a single Gemini query, emits about 0.03 grams of CO2. It's the equivalent of watching a TV for about 9 seconds, which sounds pretty small. The problem is that this information doesn't tell us much at all about different use cases for Gemini, right? There could be some wacky long tail stuff happening there. Nor does it tell us much about the effects of Gemini as a system as a whole, right? This is a new system. It's creating consumption where there didn't used to be any. And it's that sort of aggregate picture that is the picture we care about when we're thinking about the environmental impacts of it. So, can we have knowledge, though, without precision? Is one of the really interesting questions that I think the climate movement has to ask. One way we could get there would be to find out knowledge using analogies. And there's a sort of interesting set of scholars who are working with smaller open source models, training them up themselves and rigorously counting everything involved in that process, and then getting some parameters that we could then use to extrapolate out to much larger systems. So here we've got a case training up Bloom, and we get the figure that, you know, Bloom itself in training generates 50 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents over 118 days of its run. But just to keep it online after the fact is going to require the climate emissions equivalent to driving a car for 50 miles. So every day, a 50-mile drive for this little AI system. Bloom is much smaller than commercial models. So these authors extrapolated out what would ChatGPT look like if it had a similar training process to Bloom. And we get figures that it is, you know, 10 times worse. So 500 tons of CO2 just to do the training. And that's an older version of ChatGPT, GPT-3. The number system in OpenAI got broken, so like I couldn't tell you how many more we are at with GPT-5, but again, like exponential more resources go in to produce linear results. So this is a historic snapshot that does not tell us much about what's happening today, but again, it tells us the line is going up. Another indication we have of the direction of travel here is the overall environmental disclosures of tech companies. And since 2021, we've seen almost all of the big players here just really belly flop on their sustainability pledges, explicitly because of their AI investments. So Google has the goal of cutting its climate pollution in half by 2030 compared to a 2019 baseline, but its total emissions have grown by almost 50%. So exactly the opposite result since 2019. Microsoft is up at least 30% compared to a 2020 baseline. It's the company with the moonshot idea that it's going to become carbon negative by the end of the decade. But its CEO estimates that that goal is 5 times further away today than it was in 2019. So you don't love to see it. And this picture, you know, repeats across all these big companies, maybe Apple exempted. Right? Overall emissions are really aggressively increasing rather than falling as had been planned at the start of the decade. And to belabor the obvious point here, the reason why all these corporations are failing with their climate pledges is that they are rapidly building many data centers that can provide the infrastructure for these so-called AI tools. You know, Amazon's put down $150 billion over the next decade and a half explicitly for AI clients. Microsoft has this really complicated entanglement with OpenAI, and they're building too. So you may have heard that data center capital expenditures is currently this year higher than the sum of all consumer spending in the national economy. So much so that some people are worrying that this is disguising the signals of inflation in the American economy. Like, I would be really worried. I am really worried. Like, I think, you know, we're all of our economies are entangled. Your neighbors abroad are worried about you, America. Also worrying is the impact this is going to have on your electrical grids, right? So we've got a range of forecasts about how bad the problem looks to be. Some estimates hold that at the end of the decade, the trajectory of current data center growth would bring us to like 9% of all electricity in the States going to these things. You do not have the grid infrastructure or generation capacity to get there, though. So in the long term, this means that we're getting a bit of a squeeze on the resource of electricity. That means consumer prices are rising. There's concerns in many markets about brownouts and blackouts as grid resiliency takes a hit here. And currently this means that energy is a limiting factor to how fast the sector can build out this infrastructure. So like put another way, the tech sector wants to build many, many more data centers than it can, than it is currently. Its aggressive rates of growth are constrained by finite energy supply. And this means that lots of clean energy pledges are being abandoned as a lot of fossil assets step in to find new buyers. So just to name a few examples, in Kansas, we've got the life of a coal plant extended by 5 years to power, in part, a massive data center for Meta. In Virginia, where there are many, many data centers, Dominion Energy, the monopoly on that grid, has made a lot of recent gas generation investments and is also considering whether to delay retiring coal plants. And there's now a global shortage on gas turbines because of the rush to power data centers. So we then look closer at some of these communities and we find really interesting, really kind of contentious land use conflicts, particularly in areas of the world where these centers tend to get clustered. Nationally here, Virginia would be one of them. People don't like how data centers are impacting energy prices. They don't like the ways that there's a lot of like greenfield development where farmland is getting consumed, or in urban spaces, right? Areas that could otherwise have become housing. People are worried about data centers overdrawing local water reserves, particularly where they're dipping into groundwater supply. And people really hate the noise. Like living next to one of these things can be genuinely nightmarish because they are constantly emitting like low frequency vibrations from the fans. And to belabor the point here, I want to bring up one specific case study. This is Colossus, a hyperscale data center that came online in Memphis, Tennessee last year. It's planned to eventually become the world's largest AI data center. It'll take something in the ballpark of $1 billion to build it all out. It'll run maybe 1 million GPUs at the end of the build. But it's already online and already consuming more energy than the grid can supply. So the company's solution was to bring in a bunch of portable gas generators. There's a fleet of about 30 of them there. These generators are all about the size of like a big rig truck, just burning methane gas 24/7. That's about 20 more generators than they initially got permits for. So they had to, it was only after like investigative journalists put up thermal imaging drones that we got the full picture. And the amount of energy that the system is currently running, again, like not as much energy as it will when it's fully built, but today, is about 3% of the entire electrical grid in the state. So it's sort of like plunking down a utility scale gas plant in the middle of this neighborhood, a neighborhood that is majority Black and which has a long history of environmental racism, already has quite elevated levels of asthma and ER admissions. So this is being legally contested. But the company's position is that these are temporary energy assets. So as long as they're in place for less than 365 days a year in the same location, they shouldn't be subject to the Clean Air Act. That's debatable. And if you didn't already know, the company in question is Elon Musk's xAI. And all this pollution is for the benefit of training and inferencing Grok, xAI's in-suite so-called AI chatbot. And that brings us back to the informational layer of the AI trash problem, right? This whole complex exists just that a company can offer a product that's less woke and certainly less risk adverse, right? In terms of like weird sex stuff and copyright. I look at this and I think this is just kind of like degrading the informational environment of the internet, and not only for that one weird day of the year where it like kept unbidden talking to you about white genocide. And it's such an extreme example that I was sort of like hesitating about bringing it forward, because I think like one reasonable reaction you could have to this is like, well, that guy's a little bit out there, but everyone else is clearly not as bad. But the story of Grok to me seems to be a pretty clear signal about the lack of regulatory scrutiny, the lack of frameworks to prevent the worst actors in this space, let alone to constrain or shape like the merely average. So I think we got an environmental problem here and a pollution problem of our information as well. But pollution is a really interesting thing, right? Both sociologically and materially. Previously, I likened things to plastics pollution, right? There's a new technology that shows up, produces a range of harms that we're not quite sure how to effectively manage. And then there's a kind of risk that this technology could become integrated into society to such an extent that it seems impossible to get rid of it, right? Like to remove the plastic bags from the grocery store is to have a huge multi-year fight. And how do we remediate the harms that are already out there in the ocean, you know? Is AI like that? That's the analogy question. Unfortunately, unlike conventional forms of pollution, we probably don't, again, have the information that we need to have a comprehensive environmental inventory of the industry, and then just sue a bunch of companies under our existing environmental law. At least this is my assumption. Like, do let me know if you've got a different one. However, I think that we still have to think about other ways to act on this system, to intervene, either from above or from below. And so I'm kind of interested in the sort of political dividends in terms of strategies and tactics that we can get from studying this longer history of environmental pollution and environmental justice, kind of like cultural and analytic analyses of waste systems that might apply here. So Discard Studies has got some pretty good insights. Firstly, it gives us an analysis of what we can think about discarding practices as like a way of sort of diagnosing and understanding wider systems. How do these systems maintain their structures? And therefore, how does power work in these material and social arrangements? Secondly, Discard Studies encourages us to be really suspicious about the categories we've inherited through which we know our waste, because these categories are often very unhelpful. And finally, it encourages us to scrutinize the way waste problems get framed in the first place, because each has a different vantage point within the wider system that can like open and close a lot of analytic doors, right? The terms that we use really matter. So I'm very quickly going to blow through what Discard Studies might bring us for an analysis of plastics, right? Turns out if we understand the world through plastics, we understand a lot about the way that power works under global capitalism, right? There's like logistical forms, cultural forms, forms of capital accumulation that the disposability of single-use plastics make possible. That's true when they enter into consumption systems, that's true when they end them. I mentioned before that recycling predominantly happens in Southeast Asia. We are just kind of exporting the environmental harms of this system to distant lands in ways that, to a lot of eyes, looks a lot like colonialism. Secondly, we've got to complicate our categories, right? So there's many different kinds of plastics, some of which we do have decent technological means to remediate, some of which we absolutely don't. But the plastics industry keeps putting these recycling symbols on them regardless of whether or not like that's a check they can cash. And this all means that we have to have a public discourse that's complicated by this overly generic category, right? That we have debates about plastics rather than polyethylene or polypropylene, like kind of means that we have a barrier to nuance and action built into the language that we use. And finally, we should understand plastics recycling as a story of regulatory capture rather than like a moral good. So the modern recycling system was created by the beverage industry to avoid regulations that would make them responsible for the end-of-life costs of their products. Instead, there was this interesting sort of PR project to reframe the issue as one of bad individual actors through the figure of the litter bug, muddying the waters of who should be thought to be responsible. Another problem with this emphasis on the consumer is that it ignores all of the non-consumer facing waste practices. So, you know, like for some of the more famous problems like the Pacific Garbage Patch, the majority of that plastics waste comes from the fishing industry, not from people choosing to put things in the wrong bin at the coasts. Like it's industry applications, not consumer behaviors that are the biggest problem there, and quite directly. So we've got our Discard Studies account of plastic. Let's see if we can run AI through a similar gauntlet. How is the story of so-called AI a story of power and how it works in a system? Certainly the way the sector has allied itself with the Trump administration is an object lesson in regulatory capture. Again, like I think it's quite unlikely the federal government will do anything in the way of policy development or enforcement on the industry. But there might be more knowledgeable voices in the room than me on that front. But I'm really interested in sort of like what is motivating the tech sector's like AI boosterism. Like why are they wasting so much money on products that aren't making a return on investment, and whose outputs again are like pretty trashy. There's like a range of explanations, but one that I want to focus on just quickly is to zero in on a post-pandemic shift in the investment landscape. So the pandemic causes inflation, which in turn leads to the end of just an unexpectedly long run of near zero interest rates. That was a really significant factor to how the tech sector expanded. They could offer higher returns on investment than traditional financial instruments. And when that all goes away, the sector contracts, people get laid off, big players consolidate, monopoly becomes a different kind of game. And this means that workers lose their relative power within companies in the tech sector, and automation becomes just a lot more attractive to management. So I'm standing here with a growing number of scholars who are pretty convinced that this bargain holds true outside the tech sector as well. There's probably like a couple of CEOs who have just like a kind of bad understanding of what these products can do for their company. But I think there's also a lot who know that the threat of automation or the ability to like speed up and de-skill certain kinds of work, even just around the edges, like that's gonna solidify the position of management relative to labor, even if there's a lot of AI trash that gets produced in the process. And Kate Crawford's made this point quite nicely. This is something we totally miss if we're only having a discussion about sustainability or ethics, right? We need a very different set of political analyses if we begin to understand this as a question of power. And going back to Memphis, that brings us to the histories of legacies of racism and colonialism. And looking outside the US, we could also think about the kind of global self-offshoring of content moderation and the kind of more psychologically troubling parts of AI work. Secondly, there's a real need in our scholarship to stop treating all algorithmic systems as the messy bundle of things we call artificial intelligence. These words mean very little and can be really confusing as plastic is in trying to develop specificity. Right, so like I do think there's an environmental and social benefit to building up these distinctions. And I've already sung some of these verses, but I want to encourage us again to de-emphasize consumer behavior or choice in our assessment of environmental virtue and think a lot more about system level actors. I'm worried that some of the environmental politics around AI might end up looking a lot like Keep America Beautiful. So working hard to generate emotions for a part of the system people interact with at the expense of regulating the system as a whole. So if it's the system we want to shape, how should we do so? And I've got a few very quick trajectories of thinking here. One would be to look at organized labor. A huge source of optimism for us all is the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike. The Hollywood workers won out. They won protections in their contract against the use of so-called AI in writing rooms. It's great for them. It's also great for all of us because it proves that it can be done. So my faculty union is currently at the bargaining table and we're borrowing from those contracts language in our own proposals. I would love to see more sectors give this a try. A less organized but still plenty interesting set of labor actions comes in the form of algorithmic sabotage, right? Like digital Luddism in a proper sense here, where some people are finding like a degree of sanctuary or retribution if you're a digital content creator who has your stuff stolen online. And a third one, maybe a more European story than an American story at the moment, but who knows, would be to think about going after the enabling conditions in the systems that create AI slop. And I think that means revisiting the social contracts we have around the ad economy. So if we look to the EU, the GDPR seems to be a good step in this direction. The Digital Services Act is, sort of being worked through, but these policies are beginning to offer some measure of meaningful consent about the collection and sale of data. And potentially some are arguing could make it illegal to use models that have been trained on illegally procured data. That would be huge. I think that's got to be a bright line to fight for in the future. It's not perfect, but I think it's miles ahead from both the Canadian and American regulatory landscape. and it's clearly aggravating to your vice president, which is probably a good sign. And I'm at this point drifting pretty far outside of my realm of expertise, so I will be very, very excited to hear your thoughts and comments on all of this, and thank you so much for listening to me.